The air in Mobile, Alabama hung thick and oppressive in the summer of 1856, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the acrid smell of human suffering. In this southern port city where cotton fortunes were built on broken backs and shattered spirits, there lived a young woman whose name would echo through history not as a victim but as a warrior. Her name was Ruth. She was born into bondage, her first breath drawn in chains invisible yet unbreakable. By the time she reached her late teens, Ruth had witnessed horrors that would have broken lesser spirits. She had seen children torn from their mothers' arms, heard the crack of the whip against bare skin, watched as men and women were sold like cattle. The plantation was a kingdom of cruelty ruled by men who believed their wealth gave them dominion over other human beings. And among these men there was one who embodied the worst excesses: the overseer. He was not the owner but the enforcer, a man whose presence seemed to poison the air. He carried his whip as an extension of his arm, eager to taste human flesh at the slightest provocation. Ruth had felt the sting of that whip more times than she could count. The scars on her back formed a road map of pain, each raised line a testament to sadism. But physical pain was only part of the torture. The overseer developed a particular interest in Ruth. He watched her as she worked, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He found reasons to call her aside, to separate her from the others, to exercise his power in ways both subtle and overt. The other enslaved people whispered about Ruth. They saw in her something different, a spark that refused to be extinguished. In the set of her jaw and the way she held her shoulders just a fraction too straight, there was evidence of a spirit not yet broken. The overseer saw this spark too, and it enraged him. He made it his personal mission to break her completely. The punishments grew more frequent, more severe. He assigned her the hardest tasks, the most backbreaking labor, watching with satisfaction as exhaustion threatened to bring her to her knees. When she stumbled, he would strike. When she moved too slowly, he would strike. When she looked at him with those eyes that still held a hint of humanity, he would strike hardest of all. But Ruth endured. Through long days under the burning sun, through nights when her body screamed in agony, she endured. And as she endured, something changed. The fear began to transform. It crystallized into a cold, hard rage that she kept buried deep within her chest, hidden but burning. In the quarters after dark, Ruth would stare into the fire and let her mind wander to forbidden thoughts. She thought about freedom not as an abstract concept but as something tangible. She thought about stories whispered in the darkness, tales of people who had escaped. She also thought about revenge. This was the most dangerous thought of all. She imagined the overseer's face contorted not in sadistic pleasure but in fear and pain. These were dark fantasies born of desperation, but they kept her alive. The plantation operated on a rigid hierarchy. At the top sat the owner, a man who rarely involved himself in the day-to-day operations. Below him, the overseer. Below them, the enslaved people, divided by task but united in their state of suspended animation, waiting for the next blow to fall. Ruth worked primarily in the fields, though she was sometimes called to the house. This gave her a unique perspective. In the fields she saw the raw brutality. In the house she glimpsed the facade of gentility, the elaborate rituals of Southern hospitality that disguised the foundation of violence. The contrast was jarring. As the summer wore on, news began to circulate. The overseer was getting married. He had courted a young woman from a neighboring plantation, the daughter of another wealthy family. She was a belle of Southern society, pretty, accomplished, and completely oblivious to the human cost of her privileged existence. The wedding was to be a grand affair, bringing together the elite of Mobile. For the enslaved people this meant additional work. The house had to be prepared. Food had to be cooked. Servants had to be trained. But for Ruth the news carried an additional weight. The man who had tormented her for years was about to embark on a new chapter filled with happiness and social advancement. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid. While she and others like her had their humanity denied, their families torn apart, their bodies brutalized, this man would enjoy all the privileges. He would dance with his bride, receive congratulations, and sleep in comfort, while those he had tortured lay on hard pallets dreaming of impossible freedom. As the wedding date approached, Ruth was assigned to help with preparations. She cleaned the rooms, helped prepare food, performed hundreds of small tasks. The work was exhausting, but it gave her access to areas of the house she rarely saw and forced her into close proximity with the overseer. Each encounter was a test of her mask of submission. During one such encounter, the overseer called Ruth aside as she carried linens. He stood close, too close, invading her space. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. He wanted her to understand that even as he prepared to marry, his power over her remained absolute. Ruth kept her eyes downcast, her body still giving no reaction. But inside, the rage reached a new intensity. Something shifted. A decision was made, though she barely acknowledged it. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late summer. The plantation house was transformed into a scene of celebration, decorated with flowers lit by hundreds of candles. Musicians were hired. The guest list included the cream of local society, men and women whose wealth was built on the labor of people they considered property. The day arrived with a spectacular sunrise. For the enslaved workers, it meant the most demanding day they had faced in months. Every surface had to gleam. Every detail perfect. Ruth was awakened before dawn, her body aching, and immediately put to work. The bride arrived in the afternoon, accompanied by her family. She was beautiful in the way that youth and privilege create beauty. Her skin unblemished by the sun. Her hands soft. Her dress an elaborate confection of silk and lace that cost more than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. Ruth caught glimpses of her. The young woman seemed happy, genuinely excited, completely disconnected from the suffering that surrounded her. Ruth wondered what this woman knew about her husband Tob. Did she know about his cruelty? Did she care? Perhaps she saw it as necessary discipline, the natural order. Ruth would never know. As evening approached, guests began arriving in carriages. They came dressed in their finest. They were greeted with champagne and delicacies prepared by enslaved cooks who had worked through the night. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Ruth moved through this scene like a ghost, performing her tasks with mechanical precision while her mind worked through thoughts she barely dared to acknowledge. She served drinks to people who looked through her as if she were furniture. She cleared plates from tables where conversations swirled around politics, cotton prices, and gossip. She watched the overseer in his formal attire transformed by expensive clothing into something resembling a gentleman, accepting congratulations from men who saw him as a peer. The ceremony was brief but elaborate, conducted by a minister who spoke about the sanctity of marriage. The overseer and his bride exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other. Ruth stood in the corner with other enslaved servants, required to be present but invisible, witnessing a ritual that celebrated a bond while existing in a society that routinely destroyed the bonds between enslaved families. When the ceremony concluded, the celebration began. The musicians struck up a waltz and the newly married couple took to the floor for their first dance. They moved with practiced grace, smiling at each other and at the guests. More couples joined them, and soon the ballroom was filled with swirling gowns. The champagne flowed and the mood grew jovial. Ruth continued her duties, but something was building inside her with each passing moment. Every smile on the overseer's face, every tender gesture toward his bride, every congratulation he received fed the rage. She thought of all the pain he had inflicted, all the cruelty. And now he was being rewarded for it. The evening wore on and the celebration grew louder. Some guests drank too much. Others paired off for whispered conversations. The bride danced with various partners while her new husband held court with a group of men. The enslaved servants continued to work, bringing fresh wine, clearing away the detritus, maintaining the facade. During one of her trips to the kitchen, Ruth encountered an older enslaved woman named Sarah who had worked in the house for decades. Sarah looked at Ruth with eyes that had witnessed too much suffering and seemed to recognize something in the younger woman's face. "Child," Sarah said quietly, making sure no one else was within earshot. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. It ain't worth what will come after. They'll kill you and probably others besides. You think you can strike back at them, but you can't. The system's too big, too powerful. All you'll do is get yourself destroyed and give them an excuse to be even crueler to the rest of us." Ruth looked at Sarah for a long moment. Something passed between them, understanding perhaps. But Ruth said nothing. She simply took the tray she had come for and returned to the ballroom. Back in the ballroom, the party had reached its peak. The musicians played with renewed energy. The guests were flushed with alcohol and excitement, dancing with abandon. This was the planter class at play, celebrating their dominance, secure in their power, utterly convinced of their right to the world they had created. The overseer had been drinking steadily, his face red, his movements less coordinated. He kept one arm around his bride's waist possessively, as if she were another piece of property. She seemed less enthusiastic about this display as the night wore on, her smile becoming more fixed, her eyes occasionally betraying a hint of concern. But she maintained her composure, playing her role. As midnight approached, the guests began to take their leave, expressing final congratulations and making their way to waiting carriages. The house gradually emptied until only the immediate wedding party and household servants remained. The bride, exhausted, excused herself to prepare for bed. The overseer lingered downstairs with a few remaining friends, smoking cigars and continuing their discussions. Ruth was ordered to help the bride prepare for her wedding night. She found herself in the bride's chambers, a room specially decorated with fresh flowers and expensive linens. The bride sat at her vanity, removing pins from her hair, while Ruth and another servant helped her out of the wedding gown. The bride chatted idly. She talked about the wedding, about guests she had enjoyed seeing, about her hopes for her new life. She seemed genuinely happy, blissfully unaware that one of the women helping her undress had been regularly brutalized by the man she had just married. Ruth maintained her silent efficiency, responding only when directly addressed, her hands performing their tasks while her mind continued to work through thoughts that grew darker. Once the bride was settled into bed, Ruth and the other servant were dismissed. They returned downstairs to help with the final cleanup. The overseer and his friends had finally dispersed, and he had presumably gone upstairs to join his bride. The great house grew quiet, with only the sounds of servants finishing their work. Ruth moved through the cleanup process automatically, her body going through the motions while her mind had traveled somewhere else entirely. She thought about the whip scars on her back. She thought about the other enslaved people who had suffered, some of whom had died. She thought about the fundamental injustice. Something crystallized in Ruth's mind. Later historians would debate what exactly pushed her over the edge. Whether it was years of accumulated trauma reaching a breaking point, whether it was the specific indignity of serving at her tormentor's wedding celebration, or whether it was simply the spontaneous combustion of rage. But in that moment Ruth probably couldn't have articulated her reasoning. She simply knew she could not let this night end the way it was supposed to end. The other servants gradually finished their tasks and began drifting away to their quarters, exhausted. Ruth lingered, finding small tasks, waiting until she was effectively alone. The candles had been extinguished, leaving only a few burning in the hallways. The house now stood in near silence. Ruth knew the layout intimately. She knew which floorboards creaked, which stairs could be climbed silently. She knew where every room was located. And she knew where the overseer and his bride would be sleeping in the master's suite. She also knew where the overseer kept his whip. It hung on a peg in his office, always within reach, a constant reminder of his power. Ruth had been summoned to that office many times, had felt the sting of that particular whip. The weapon had become almost symbolic, an embodiment of all the cruelty and injustice. Ruth stood in the darkened hallway, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to return to the quarters, to let this night end as it was supposed to survive, as she had always survived, by enduring, by bending but not breaking. But something had shifted irreversibly. The part of her that had learned survival through submission was being drowned out by a louder voice, one that spoke of dignity and justice and the fundamental wrongness of everything she had experienced. Ruth moved through the house like a sleepwalker, her feet carrying her toward the overseer's office almost of their own accord. The office door opened silently. Moonlight filtered through the window, providing just enough illumination. And there, hanging on its peg, was the whip. Ruth approached it slowly, her hand trembling as she reached out. The leather was worn smooth in places from years of use, stained with sweat and perhaps with traces of blood. The handle felt solid in her grip, heavier than she had expected, weighted with more than just physical mass. For a long moment Ruth simply stood there holding the whip, letting the reality of what she was considering wash over her. If she went upstairs now, there would be no going back. The consequences would be severe. They would kill her, certainly, probably torture her first, then hang her publicly. They might punish other enslaved people as well. Sarah's warning echoed in her mind. The old woman had been right about the futility, the danger. But Ruth realized she had moved beyond calculation of consequences. Something inside her had already died, killed by years of systematic brutalization, and what remained was willing to trade whatever time she had left for one moment of striking back. It was not rational. It was not strategic. But it was human in the most fundamental way, the refusal to accept endless degradation without response. Ruth left the office, the whip coiled in her hand, and began climbing the stairs toward the master suite. Each step was deliberate, careful to avoid the boards she knew would creak. The house remained silent around her. No one suspected. No one imagined that one of the people they had rendered invisible was about to make herself terrifyingly visible. The door to the master suite stood before her, heavy oak with brass fittings. Ruth placed her hand on the handle and pushed gently. The door swung open smoothly, well-oiled hinges making no sound. Inside, the room was dark except for the faint glow of a single candle burning low. She could make out the shape of the large bed, and in it the two figures, both deep in sleep. Ruth stepped inside, closing the door behind her with exquisite care. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, observing the scene. The overseer lay on his back, snoring slightly, one arm thrown across his chest. His bride slept curled on her side, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face peaceful. They looked vulnerable in sleep, stripped of their social armor, just two humans in the temporary oblivion that night brings. For a brief instant doubt flickered through Ruth's mind. The bride had done nothing directly to her, was guilty of nothing more than being born into and accepting the world as she found it. But then Ruth thought about all the enslaved women who had their wedding nights interrupted by being sold away from their husbands. All the mothers whose children were torn from their arms. All the people who had no control over the most intimate aspects of their lives because people like this woman and her new husband believed they had the right to own other human beings. Ruth uncoiled the whip, feeling the weight of it in her hand, the same weight the overseer had felt countless times before, using it against her and others. She thought about every time she had felt its bite, every time she had stood before him knowing the blow was coming and being powerless to prevent it. She thought about the helplessness, the humiliation, the systematic destruction of dignity. And she thought about the fact that after all of that, this man got to celebrate, to marry, to sleep peacefully in comfort, while she was supposed to simply accept her degradation as the natural order. The first crack of the whip shattered the silence like a thunderclap. The leather struck the overseer across his legs, and he jolted awake with a yell of pain and confusion. Before he could fully process what was happening, the whip fell again and again. Ruth struck with all the strength and rage she had accumulated over years of suffering. The whip found its target with accuracy born of bitter familiarity. The overseer scrambled to escape, tangled in the bed linens, his shouts of pain mixing with incoherent curses. The bride woke screaming, her peaceful sleep shattered by violence she had never experienced and could barely comprehend. She tried to flee the bed but became entangled in her nightgown and the bedding. Ruth's whip found her too, not with the same concentrated fury, but enough to mark her, enough to ensure she would carry physical reminders. The young woman's screams joined her husband's, creating a cacophony that began to wake others. Ruth felt nothing in those moments except the pure release of years of suppressed rage. Her arm rose and fell with mechanical precision, the whip an extension of her will, each strike a word in a statement she had never been allowed to make. The overseer managed to get off the bed and tried to advance toward her, but she drove him back with strikes to his face and chest. He stumbled backward, crashing into furniture, his drunkenness and disorientation making his movements clumsy. The sound of running feet echoed in the hallway outside. Other household members and servants drawn by the screams. Ruth knew her time was measured in seconds now. She could hear voices shouting, people demanding to know what was happening. The whole house erupting into chaos, but she didn't stop. She continued to strike until the door burst open and several men rushed into the room, tackling her to the ground. The whip was torn from her grasp and hands pinned her arms behind her back with brutal force. The room filled with people. Candles were lit, illuminating a scene burned into memory. The overseer stood against the far wall, his nightshirt torn and bloody, his face marked by red welts. His bride huddled on the floor, sobbing hysterically, her nightgown disheveled and marked. And Ruth, held down by multiple men, stared up at her attacker with eyes that showed no fear, no regret, only a fierce satisfaction at having finally struck back. The overseer, once he had gathered himself, began screaming orders. He wanted Ruth killed immediately, right there in the room. His voice cracked with rage and something else, perhaps the shock of having experienced even briefly the kind of helpless terror he had inflicted on others. But cooler heads prevailed, at least temporarily. The plantation owner, woken by the commotion, took control. Ruth was dragged from the room, down the stairs, and thrown into a storage cellar that could serve as a temporary prison. In the darkness of that cellar, with her body beginning to register the injury sustained when she was tackled, Ruth sat against the cold stone wall and allowed herself to feel something like peace for the first time in years. She knew what was coming. They would make an example of her, ensure her death was public and terrible. But in that moment she felt free in a way she had never experienced while alive. She had refused to accept her degradation passively. She had struck back, had made him feel even a fraction of the fear and pain he had inflicted. Upstairs the house remained in chaos for hours. The bride was inconsolable, her fantasy of married bliss shattered. The overseer, after having his wounds tended to, paced furiously, planning elaborate revenge. The other enslaved people on the plantation, woken by the commotion and gradually learning what had happened, experienced a complex mixture of emotions: fear of inevitable retribution, concern for Ruth, and beneath it all a carefully hidden sense of satisfaction that someone had finally done what many had dreamed of doing. News of the incident spread rapidly through mobile slave community, carried by the invisible network of communication that existed among the enslaved. Within days every enslaved person in the region knew about Ruth, about what she had done, about how she had whipped the overseer and his bride on their wedding night. The story was told and retold, each telling adding to its power as a narrative of resistance. For people who had so few stories of successful defiance to sustain them, Ruth's action became legendary almost immediately. The white community reacted with predictable outrage and fear. The incident was seen as an intolerable breach of the social order, a challenge to the entire system of control. If enslaved people could strike back at their masters with impunity, the whole structure of Southern society was threatened. Ruth had to be punished severely, not just for what she had done, but to send a message. The days following were marked by tension. The enslaved community moved with heightened anxiety, knowing collective punishment was possible. The overseers now patrolled with greater vigilance, watching everyone with suspicious eyes. The whip fell more frequently, as if increased brutality could restore the sense of absolute control Ruth had shattered. Ruth remained in the cellar, locked in darkness. They brought her no food for the first 2 days, only water enough to keep her alive. She could hear the sounds of the plantation continuing above her, but she was separated from all of it, held in a space between her former life and whatever ending awaited. On the 3rd day the door opened and several men entered carrying torches. They hauled her to her feet, roughly binding her hands behind her back with rope that cut into her wrists. As they dragged her up the stairs and out of the house, she caught glimpses of the other enslaved people watching from a distance, their faces carefully blank. Sarah stood near the kitchen door, her weathered face showing a mixture of sorrow and something else that might have been respect. They took Ruth to a cleared area near the main barn, a space visible from much of the plantation. A crowd was already gathering: white overseers and managers, enslaved people ordered to attend, and even some neighboring planters. The plantation owner stood at the center, his face grave. The injured overseer was there too, still bearing the marks, his expression a mask of barely controlled rage and satisfaction. Ruth was forced to her knees in the center. A man she didn't recognize brought in specifically for this task stood nearby holding a whip far more brutal than the one she had used, a cat of nine tails designed to inflict maximum damage. The plantation owner began to speak, his voice carrying across the crowd. He talked about the necessity of order, about the natural hierarchy, about the consequences of disrupting that order. He spoke of Ruth's crime as an assault not just on one man but on the entire system of civilization. What followed was a demonstration of systematic cruelty. The whipping was conducted methodically, designed to last long enough to serve as a deterrent while stopping short of killing her immediately. They wanted her to survive long enough to suffer more. Each strike tore flesh, and Ruth's blood soon stained the ground. She had been ordered not to scream, told that any sound would result in additional lashes. For the first dozen lashes, Ruth maintained her silence through sheer force of will, biting down on her own lip until it bled. But the human body has limits, and eventually sounds escaped her, not quite screams but low guttural noises torn from deep within. The man wielding the whip showed no emotion, his arm rising and falling with practiced efficiency. The enslaved people forced to watch struggled with their own reactions. Some kept faces blank. Others wept quietly. A few had to look away. The white observers watched with varying degrees of satisfaction and discomfort. When the whipping finally ended, Ruth collapsed forward onto the blood-soaked ground, barely conscious. But her ordeal was not over. The plantation owner announced that she would be sold away, sent to the deep south where conditions were notoriously worse, where she would work in swamps and cane fields until her body gave out. This was meant as a fate worse than death, a prolonged torture. It also served to remove her from the plantation, where she might become a martyr. They threw Ruth into a wagon along with several other enslaved people being sold. She lay in the wagon bed, each movement sending new waves of agony through her shredded back. The others looked at her with a mixture of fear and awe. They knew what she had done and understood both the courage and the terrible price. The journey to the slave market took several days. Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, her wounds becoming infected, fever burning through her. The traders showed minimal care necessary to keep their cargo alive long enough to sell. During brief moments of lucidity, Ruth would think about what she had done. She felt no regret for striking back but wondered about the cost to others. Had her action resulted in harsher treatment for those left behind? Had it served any purpose beyond her own need for that one moment of resistance? These questions troubled her. But Ruth didn't know something crucial. Her story was already spreading far beyond the plantation. Enslaved people across the South were hearing about the woman who had whipped her overseer on his wedding night. The story was told in the quarters after dark, whispered during brief moments of gathering. Each telling added details, some true, some embellished, until Ruth became almost mythical, a symbol of resistance, proof that fighting back was possible even at terrible cost. The slave market was a nightmare. Human beings displayed like livestock, examined physically in degrading ways. Ruth's scarred back and weakened condition made her less valuable. But there was still a market for damaged slaves in operations where life expectancy was measured in months. She was purchased by a buyer representing a sugar plantation in Louisiana, one of the most brutal forms of agricultural slavery. The sugar harvest was so demanding and dangerous it killed workers at an appalling rate. Ruth was shackled together with others and loaded onto a riverboat. During the river journey, Ruth found herself chained next to an older man who had been enslaved his entire life. He knew who she was. Her story had reached him. He told her that what she had done mattered, that it gave others hope. He said resistance took many forms and her form had been spectacular enough to be remembered. Ruth wasn't sure she believed him. She felt like a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. But the old man insisted she didn't understand the full impact. Throughout the South, enslaved people were talking about her. Some would be inspired to their own acts of resistance. Others would draw strength simply from knowing that someone had fought back. The story of Ruth would become part of the oral tradition of resistance passed down through generations. The sugar plantation was as brutal as its reputation. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. The hours endless. The overseers cruel. The scarring on her back marked her as a troublemaker, which meant even harsher treatment. But Ruth had already made her peace with death. She had struck her blow, had refused to accept endless degradation passively, and whatever came after was simply the price. What Ruth couldn't have known was that her story was reaching beyond the enslaved community. Some white abolitionists in the North heard about the incident. They seized on her story as evidence of the fundamental injustice of slavery, as proof that enslaved people were not passive victims but human beings capable of resistance and dignity. Her act was written about in abolitionist newspapers. The South's white population had a very different reaction. To them, Ruth's story confirmed their worst fears about what would happen if slavery was not maintained through constant vigilance and brutal punishment. They pointed to her case as evidence that enslaved people were dangerous and needed to be controlled through force. The two sides of the growing national debate over slavery used Ruth's story to support their opposing positions. On the sugar plantation, Ruth survived longer than many expected. Perhaps the same force of will that had driven her to resist helped her endure conditions that broke others more quickly. She became known among the enslaved workers as someone who had fought back, and this gave her a kind of status. Other workers would sometimes seek her out, wanting to hear the story directly, drawing strength from her presence. The years blurred together in a haze of unrelenting labor and physical suffering. During harvest season, enslaved workers labored from before dawn until well after dark, cutting cane, hauling loads, working in the suffocating heat of sugar houses. The machinery was dangerous, claiming fingers, hands, sometimes entire limbs. Ruth's scarred back made certain movements excruciating, and the overseers showed no mercy. But something fundamental had changed in Ruth during that night when she had wielded the whip. The part of her that feared death had died, and what remained was harder to break. In the quarters at night, Ruth would sometimes tell her story to those who asked. She didn't embellish. The simple facts were powerful enough. She spoke of the years of abuse, of the wedding night when something inside her finally broke free, of the moment she had picked up that whip. She always emphasized the cost. She didn't want to inspire reckless rebellion that would get people killed without achieving anything meaningful. Instead, she tried to help others understand that resistance could take many forms, from spectacular acts of violence to quieter forms of defiance, the preservation of family bonds, the maintenance of cultural traditions, small acts of sabotage, work slowdowns, networks of mutual aid. These were all forms of resistance, less visible but no less important. News from the wider world occasionally filtered into the plantation. There was talk of a presidential election of a candidate named Lincoln who opposed the expansion of slavery of southern states threatening to secede. The enslaved workers listened with intense interest, knowing their fates hung in the balance. Ruth lived to see the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the subsequent secession that led to the Civil War. The war's impact was immediate. White men left to fight, leaving the plantation understaffed and difficult to control. The enslaved workers, sensing the shift, began to engage in more overt resistance, working more slowly, feigning illness, disappearing into the swamps. As Union forces advanced, word spread about contraband camps where escaped slaves were given refuge and freedom. Ruth, despite her weakened condition, felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The possibility of freedom, which had seemed like an impossible dream, suddenly appeared as a tangible reality. The plantation's overseers, desperate to maintain control as their world collapsed, became even more brutal. Several enslaved people were killed for minor infractions. The overseers seemed determined to extract every ounce of labor and inflict every possible cruelty before their power was stripped away. In the spring of 1863, Union forces captured New Orleans and began pushing into surrounding areas. The plantation was close enough that everyone could sense the approaching change. Some enslaved workers began slipping away at night, heading toward Union lines. Those who remained grew bolder, knowing the old system was dying. Ruth made her decision during a sweltering night in July 1863. She gathered with a small group of others who had decided to make a run for Union lines. They knew the journey would be dangerous. Confederate patrols were looking for escaped slaves, and the swamps were treacherous. But the chance of freedom outweighed the risks. They set out under cover of darkness, following routes mapped by those who had gone before. The journey took 3 days. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day. They waded through swamps where water moccasins and alligators posed threats. They heard patrols in the distance and had to freeze in place, barely breathing. Ruth's scarred back ached constantly and her body weakened, threatened to give out multiple times, but she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that this might be her only chance to die free. On the 4th day they encountered a Union patrol. The soldiers quickly realized they were dealing with escaped slaves. The patrol escorted them to a contraband camp where hundreds of other formerly enslaved people had gathered. The camp was chaotic and poorly supplied, but it represented something Ruth had never experienced before, a place where she was not property, where no one had the legal right to beat her or sell her or control her movements. The transition from slavery to freedom was not instantaneous or simple. Ruth and others had spent their entire lives in bondage, their identities shaped by the constant need to survive. Freedom brought its own challenges: how to support oneself, how to navigate a world with agency but also responsibility, how to process trauma. Ruth initially worked as a laundress for the Union Army, one of the few paid positions available to formerly enslaved women. The work was hard, but it was work she chose to do and for which she received compensation. For someone who had spent her entire life in forced labor, this distinction was profound. She could walk away if she wanted to, could negotiate for better conditions, could make decisions about her own time and labor. These were small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary. As the war continued, Ruth encountered other formerly enslaved people who knew her story. Her act of resistance in Mobile 9 years earlier had become legendary. Young people spoke of Ruth as if she were a figure from mythology. She found this attention uncomfortable. She didn't see herself as heroic, merely as someone who had reached a breaking point and acted. But the old man on the riverboat had been right. Her story had mattered. It had given people hope, had proved resistance was possible, had become part of the larger narrative of enslaved resistance, crucial to the destruction of slavery itself. Ruth's individual act had not by itself changed the system, but it had been part of a larger pattern of resistance, from individual acts to organized rebellions to the self-emancipation of hundreds of thousands during the war that had made slavery unsustainable. The Emancipation Proclamation, when news reached the camp, was met with jubilation tempered by understanding that legal freedom was only the first step. Ruth stood among the celebrating crowd, listening to the proclamation being read, and felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that she would never again be property, grief for all those who had died in slavery, anger that it had taken a war to achieve what should have been a fundamental human right. After the war ended, Ruth settled in New Orleans, joining the community of formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives in the chaotic Reconstruction era. She found work as a seamstress and later as a cook, modest occupations that represented a life of her own choosing. She never married. The trauma had left scars deeper than those on her back. But she became an important figure in her community, someone younger people came to for advice and support. Ruth lived long enough to see the promises of Reconstruction betrayed, to watch as the brief flowering of black political power and civil rights was crushed by the restoration of white supremacy through violence and legal mechanisms. The disappointment was profound, but Ruth had survived too much to be broken. She continued to live with the same stubborn dignity that had carried her through slavery. In her final years, Ruth would sometimes sit with young people and tell them about the old days, not to glorify suffering but to ensure the truth of slavery was not forgotten or sanitized. She wanted them to understand both the horrors and the ways people had resisted. She told them about the night she had picked up the whip, not as encouragement for random violence but as evidence that enslaved people had not been passive victims, had not simply accepted degradation without response. Ruth died in 1884 at the age of approximately 52. She was buried in a cemetery for black residents of New Orleans, her grave marked with a simple stone. There was no mention of what she had done. But her story didn't die with her. It was passed down through generations, kept alive in family histories and community narratives. Eventually, historians interested in enslaved resistance would uncover references to Ruth in plantation records, newspaper accounts, oral histories. Ruth's story became part of a larger understanding of slavery as a system constantly contested. Modern historians recognize that enslaved people engaged in resistance at every level, from spectacular rebellions to daily acts of defiance. Ruth's act was one data point in a vast array of evidence that enslaved people never accepted their enslavement passively, never internalized the ideology that claimed they were suited for bondage. The wedding night of 1856 lasted only minutes, but its reverberations extended across decades and eventually centuries. Her act reminded everyone who heard about it that enslaved people were human beings with agency, capable of fighting back even when the cost was terrible. It demonstrated that slavery was maintained not through natural order but through violence, and that violence could potentially be turned back. Ruth's legacy is complex. Some see her act as heroic resistance, others as tragic violence born of an intolerable system. But what cannot be disputed is that she refused to accept endless degradation without response. She claimed her humanity in the most visceral way by striking back at the man who had tried to reduce her to an object without will or dignity. And in doing so she became part of the long tradition of resistance that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction. The system that enslaved Ruth and millions of others would eventually be destroyed not by any single act but by the accumulated weight of resistance at every level, combined with broader political and military forces. But every act of resistance, from the spectacular to the mundane, contributed. Ruth's whipping of her overseer on his wedding night was one thread in a vast tapestry of defiance, and her story remains a powerful reminder that those who were enslaved never stopped fighting for their freedom and dignity, no matter the cost.